8 months ago, I released a video called Let's Talk About Non-Binary Representation, in which I discussed the very thing in the title, explaining the basic concept, giving some rules for what makes for good representation, and going down a list of characters I thought were good examples at the time. And while I wish I'd remembered to speak at a reasonable pace, I'm honestly still quite proud of it, and I still stand by basically everything I said in that video, except for the bit about Ruby with a mustache. That was just wrong and stupid, and I should have actually investigated the truth instead of spouting a half-remembered meme. That was on me, and I apologise. Anyway, in that video, I spent a decent amount of time explaining my reasoning behind Rule 6, which was try to depict non-binary people with a variety of gender expressions. Masculine and androgynous non-binary characters are just as important as feminine ones. This rule is something I've actually been thinking about lately, and as more non-binary representation comes out and more people become comfortable with depicting non-binary characters in media, I thought it might be a good idea to talk about designing non-binary characters, what you should consider when making them, and what you should avoid doing. Think of this as a crash course in creating non-binary characters coming straight from the NB's mouth. I do want to stress though that I still do not speak for all non-binary people. I did not win the election, I'm sorry. And I want to remind people that if you're cisgender or even a binary trans person, it's never a bad idea to run your ideas for a non-binary character past a sensitivity reader. And if you'd ever like my thoughts or opinions on a non-binary character or story idea, or you just want to say hello, my Tumblr Ask box is always open. I'll put the link in the description in case you'd like to take advantage of my offer. I'll mainly be focusing on animation and video games in this video, since that's where character design comes in the most. I mean, live action also requires character design, but the character's appearance is always pulled from the actor in question and not built from the ground up. Finally, if you enjoy my content and can afford to, I'd like to ask you to consider joining my Patreon. We're coming up on an especially hard time of year, and anything you can spare would be greatly appreciated. With all that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? Let's talk about non-binary character design. Part 1. The basics of being non-binary. I'd like to start out by recognising that some of this is going to be hard for my cisgender viewers to understand, and that's okay. While I'll do my best to make this as simple as possible, I do have to admit that in some ways, this will be like a hummingbird trying to explain flight to a dolphin. But try to follow along as best you can, and I'll try to make this easy for you, okay? Okay. We'll start with identity. Back in my video on NB Rep, I talked about how important it is to depict different forms of gender presentation. And this is actually one of the most important things to keep in mind when making a non-binary character. See, the non-binary gender identity is fundamentally different from my binary gender identity in that it's not something given to you at birth, it's something you discover about yourself. This is also true of binary trans people as well, but the difference lies in shared experiences. While each individual's lived experiences are unique to them, only growing more so as they become members of different groups, the experiences of the members of a group tend to share similarities. Look at basically any group at all, women, homosexuals, people of colour, etc., and you'll find that they share similar experiences and traumas, often those they've encountered since birth, as well as things that they've been taught to expect throughout their lives. Even binary trans people have these, though they generally don't start for them until they crack that egg. Non-binary people don't really have that because each NB's relationship to their gender is unique and somewhat strange, and even among members of the same type of NB, agender, polygender, gender fluid, etc., their own relationship to that identity is singular. And yes, I recognise that gender as a concept is weird and complex and stressful, and everyone struggles with it in one way or another, but I can't cover everything, so let's just leave that aside for now, okay? A non-binary person's relationship to gender will also be affected by the gender they previously identified with. For instance, I was assigned male at birth, and that's both determined my experiences as a person, as well as coloured my relationship to the concept of gender itself. I've mentioned before that I'm agender, and I'm uncomfortable being gendered by other people at all. However, I'm less uncomfortable with being gendered in a feminine way, as it doesn't carry the same internal connotations as masculine gendering does. Feminine gendering still isn't something I enjoy, but I do find it less distressing, if that makes sense. To try to simplify my feelings on the subject, because maleness is the thing that was first on me, and often still very much is, I find it more upsetting. And while other NBs may feel the same way, not all of them do. This is just the simplified complexities of my own relationship to my own gender. And every non-binary person has feelings just as complicated about their own. The term non-binary itself is also rather complicated, as it doubles both as an identity and an umbrella term for the larger array of more specific identities. And you know what? It's honestly okay if you find all of this hard to understand. Growing up, most people are taught that all humans fall into one of two categories, male or female, and that there are hard and fast rules regarding these things. But as you mature, you learn that not only are these rules more flexible than you were initially led to believe, but they're not even rules to begin with. And it can be hard to adjust to having to look beyond the gender dichotomy that you were raised to believe in. And make no mistake, it is something you have to learn. It's something you have to either be taught or seek education for yourself on. That's one of the reasons I make content like this, to try and make it easier for people to understand the reality they can suddenly find themselves thrust into. For example, I personally identify as agender and exclusively use they/them pronouns. And while that's the most commonly understood expression of being non-binary, pronouns and people widely vary. Some people may use both gendered and non-gendered pronouns, like he, they, or she, they, or even he, she, they, depending on the specifics of their identity and their personal relationship to the concept of gender itself. Some people may use neopronouns, and some people may even prefer to be referred to exclusively by their own name, or even as it, the latter being a rather contentious topic in the community. Something that I will not be weighing in on in this video, because I already have too much to talk about right now. I really hope I haven't already made this too complicated for you, but don't worry if I have. I'll try to simplify this more when I talk about characters. Moving on from that, let's talk about gender expression / presentation. This is, I think, the primary factor most people consider when designing a non-binary character, though most would only think of it in terms of appearance. Gender expression is the way a person chooses to externalize their gender identity. And while this is indeed done through physical appearance, such as hairstyles and clothing, it's also expressed through behavior and mannerisms. This is often where society's traditional understanding of gender comes in, as all people have traits that, while technically being gender neutral, are understood to be more traditionally masculine or feminine. Things like long or short hair, dresses, pants, and painted nails, but also things like the pitch or tone of your voice, demureness versus aggression, or if you spread your legs on public transportation. Whether you realize it or not, you've likely already mentally determined each of these things to be either masculine or feminine, and that's because most people's understanding of human behavior functions with that binary in mind. We're conditioned to see all things as either masculine or feminine to a certain degree, and people have to learn to view things outside of that dichotomy. This isn't even getting into primary and secondary sexual characteristics, things like breasts, facial hair, or the specific content of your joy department. Things that largely cannot be controlled. These are all things that other people use to identify someone as either male or female, whether or not that analysis coincides with the individual's actual gender. As I said earlier, all of this, the factors that make up your appearance, tend to be what people primarily consider when making a non-binary character. And while this itself isn't a problem per se, it can sometimes be symptomatic of a very narrow mindset that I've noticed leads to a reoccurring theme when creating non-binary characters, which further leads into an issue wherein non-binary representation tends to be rather samey and can, in some ways, end up accidentally harming the very people you're trying to represent. I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about this, and as such, I don't know if there's like an agreed upon term for what I'm talking about, or if like an actually important YouTuber has already brought this up. So for the purpose of this video, I'm simply going to be calling it Part 2, the androgyny issue. I feel I should probably preface this section by clarifying that I have no actual problem with androgyny as a concept or people who choose to present as such. No matter your gender identity, the way that you are the happiest and most comfortable presenting is correct, and fuck anyone who tells you otherwise. No, I'm specifically talking about the issues that arise from the increasingly common design decision of making non-binary characters as androgynous as possible. Something I've noticed about non-binary character design is that people tend to treat gender markers as a sort of zero-sum game. They think of gender as a spectrum, with one end being fully female and the other being fully male. Using this logic, to be non-binary is to fall directly in the middle, and so one way that they'll attempt to accomplish this is by balancing out gender indicators as much as possible. If a character has a more masculine frame or voice, then they'll be given longer hair or nail polish or more feminine clothing in an attempt to keep the gender scales from tipping too far in one direction or the other. We'll call this design approach 1. It's not really as common as the following two though. Design approach 2 is to fully androgynize the character's features, essentially scrubbing away any indicators of gender. This normally means things like bulky or concealing clothing to hide the body itself, an androgynous voice and haircut. This is one of the more popular approaches as of late. Finally, design approach 3 is to completely mask the character, or just make them non-human. This approach is, well, it's not strictly bad, but it does carry certain connotations. I actually went over my thoughts on non-human non-binary characters in the representation video, and I don't want to go into it in extreme detail here, so just go back and check out Rule 3 if you want a refresher on my feelings on the matter. Now, these 3 options are not the only ways that people approach designing non-binary characters, but they are definitely the most common. And in a vacuum, none of them is necessarily a bad decision. But the problem is that following this kind of design ethos is both restrictive and, unfortunately, kind of unhelpful for representation in the long run. It also has the problem of approaching the creation of non-binary characters from a binary perspective, but I'll come back to that later. Let's talk about the restrictiveness first. A common sentiment I've heard from people is that non-binary characters have massive character design potential, and I do agree with that, but I don't think it's in the same way as other people. I'll expand on that in a little while, but first I'd like you to consider 3 characters that have recently been added to the rosters of 3 different games: Bloodhound from Apex Legends, Clove from Valorant, and Venture from Overwatch. The thing they all share, aside from the fact that they all appear in popular hero shooters, is that they're all completely androgynous in design, albeit in different ways. Bloodhound is a clear case of design approach 3, with all their skins completely covering their body, while Clove falls mainly under approach 1 and Venture under approach 2. Clove's design is largely defined by a balance of colour and clothing, though it leans a bit more towards the feminine. Also, I really love their butterfly motif and I think more characters should use that, but that's neither here nor there. Venture, meanwhile, is largely devoid of gender markers, with neutral colours, bulky and concealing clothing, and an androgynous face and voice. All 3 characters are very neutral in the gender presentation, and each is also the only playable non-binary character in their respective games. And I'd actually like to focus on Venture for just a moment, because I think they best represent the problem of restriction that I've been slowly meandering my way towards talking about. For those who don't know, Venture was added to Overwatch as their first non-binary character on April 16th of 2024, nearly 8 months ago at time of writing. However, in all that time, Venture has not gained a single legendary skin, not even in the shop, and if you've played Overwatch at all since its disappointing relaunch as Overwatch 2, you should know just how weird that is. The Overwatch team is obsessed with selling people skins. They've buckled down on making more and more skins with a kind of fervour usually only shown by religious crusaders. It's genuinely concerning at times. But like I said, Venture has yet to receive a new legendary skin. You know, the fun ones, the actual costume changes and not just a glorified palette swap. And it's not like there isn't a demand for them. Venture fans have been bemoaning the lack of affection being shown to our favourite NB archaeologist for months, but to no avail. And if I had to guess the reason why Overwatch hasn't added anything new for them, it'd be because of the androgyny issue. See, the problem with each of these characters is how the developers use them. I'm going to come back to this a little later, but there's this unspoken notion when it comes to making non-binary characters that you have to make them represent non-binary people as a whole, that they have to be the non-binary character. And for all the reasons mentioned in part 1, that just doesn't work. But the problem this presents for Venture is that I think the devs are afraid of gendering them at all. Venture is so gender neutral in presentation that a push in either direction would drastically unbalance their character design. And Overwatch already has an extremely homophobic and transphobic player base that's in desperate need of smack-hard fumigation. So the devs are very likely afraid that any gendered change to their base design will result in backlash from the LGBT community, as well as an increase in strife in the player base, as the transphobes use it as another excuse to misgender the character. So they're kind of trapped as they attempt to figure out how to navigate the unenviable situation they've locked themselves into. And off the top of my head, I can think of 2 ways this whole issue could be fixed. They could add a second non-binary hero with a different gender presentation, or they could give up this fixation on androgyny that's ultimately doing more harm than good. See, this is where we get into the real meat of the androgyny issue, because believe it or not, most NBs are not androgynous. Big NB doesn't want you to know this, but most of us just look like anybody else. While there absolutely are NBs that present as neutrally as possible, most of us present as we look because we don't really have a choice. You can't choose the body you're born in, and the vast majority of people can't afford the kind of costly surgery it would take to change that. And if I may be very real for a moment, this is largely where dysphoria comes from. Gender dysphoria is the term for the mental distress caused by a person's body not matching their gender identity, and while not all trans or non-binary people suffer from it, nor do you need to suffer from it to be trans or non-binary, a lot of us do. But where a binary trans person has the potential solution of hormone replacement therapy and gender reassignment surgery, a lot of NPs don't really have that. And not just because of money, but, well, what would you really have us do? While some have the option of mastectomies or electrolysis or even a certain level of HRT, these tend to be used to move away from where we are, but not toward a real end goal, because completely changing your body from masculine to feminine or vice versa doesn't fix the problem that you still don't identify with either binary gender. This is why, for non-binary people, gender affirming care so often falls under the purview of social transition, of being referred to by our correct pronouns and not being forced into certain gendered roles. This is all a very long-winded way to say that while fully androgynous characters are fun, I actually really like Venture, and I hope I didn't give the wrong impression, they don't really tend to represent us as much as these game developers might think, and they also tend to give people a very narrow idea of what being non-binary even looks like. Do you know the point of representation in media? Like the actual goal behind having it at all? If you're extremely cynical, you might say it's so companies can appeal to a wider audience, and if you're an asshole, you might claim it's part of an agenda to ruin media because you're a tweaked little bitch, but neither of these is correct. The true point of representation is to raise awareness of and normalize the existence of marginalized groups. Entertainment media can often be someone's first introduction to the idea that certain groups, such as members of the LGBT community, even exist. But if all people ever see is a single kind of representation, that's the only form they're being taught to recognize. And so if the only version of being non-binary that people are exposed to is the androgynous variety, where does that leave people who aren't androgynous? Where does that leave the masc or femme presenting among us? And don't you dare try to tell me this doesn't matter, because if you've never been told to your face that someone isn't going to respect your pronouns because you're too masculine or feminine for them to see you as non-binary, then you have no idea how much it hurts. Look, I don't want to give people the impression that making a non-binary character androgynous is bad in any way, and I certainly don't want people to think that if you're not non-binary, then you shouldn't be making non-binary characters, because neither of these is true. But I do want to point out that this tendency to constantly restrict non-binary characters to purely gender-neutral or androgynous character design just isn't helpful, and is ironically a very close-minded way of including diversity. Take Testament from Guilty Gear, for example. While they were only just recently fully confirmed to be non-binary in the English release of the series, their gender has been hinted at in the Japanese versions, and until recently, Testament has also had a fairly masculine presentation, with sharper facial features and more pronounced musculature. They had long hair and somewhat feminine clothing, but their overall design was definitely more masc-leaning. But as soon as they were announced in English to be non-binary, they had their look changed, their features were softened, and their clothing became less revealing. And while this does fit the art style of the game, and yes, most of the characters were redesigned, I've spoken to NB Gears fans, one of which being a close friend of mine who absolutely loves Testament, who felt disappointed by the change. Testament just didn't feel the same, and it made the reveal of their gender identity feel double-edged in a way. And while I'm not a Gears fan, I can kind of understand the sentiment. It's not just that a favourite character was made less familiar, it's that it feels like the devs looked at a fairly masculine body type and said, well, that can't be non-binary. And speaking as a fairly masculine looking NB, that's a dishearteningly familiar sentiment. I want to make it clear, I don't think any of the characters I brought up so far have been examples of bad representation, but I think it's important to recognise the difference between great representation and representation that's just good enough. So let's finally talk about how to make a non-binary character then. Let's talk about how we go from good enough to great. Part 3. Building the non-binary. So here's the thing I need people to understand about making a non-binary character. Their physical appearance should not be the first thing you consider. Just as with any character, the actual characterization is the most important thing to develop, and when it comes to making an NB, their relationship to their gender should be at the forefront of your mind during the process, right behind their personality. Even if you don't plan on exploring that relationship in story, it should still be what informs the way you design the character. Simply taking a character and adding gender-neutral pronouns is fine, but it's how you get good enough, not great. Personality and backstory are the most important parts of building a character, and these should always inform their actions and how they conduct themselves. Speaking of conduct, let's talk about what makes for bad representation. Because while there really aren't any bad options for how you make a non-binary character look, who they are is going to say a lot more than the worst design ever could. And to explore the subject, let's take a look at our old friend, Double Trouble from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Double Trouble is one of the more troubling examples of non-binary representation that I've seen. Because as the sole non-binary trans character in the show, notice how this is a constant sticking point. They have the unfortunate effect of representing all non-binary people within the text of the story, and what it says about them isn't great. Double Trouble is an asshole. They're completely untrustworthy, switching allegiances and siding with whoever pays them the most with absolutely no care for the damage caused or who they hurt. They actively enjoy watching the fallout of their actions and treat the war as a form of entertainment. They're basically just a sadistic, self-absorbed drama whore, utterly incapable of connecting to others or seemingly even displaying empathy. Everything about them is utterly removed from the people around them, making them a complete outsider to the world of She-Ra, and unfortunately, their appearance only exacerbates this. While the show has other lizard people, such as Rogelio, Double Trouble is the only one who looks or acts the way they do, with sideways blinking eyes and a wispy alien appearance. And according to an interview, this isn't even their real form, which further distances them from the other characters in the show. And these elements combined create a character that just cannot belong in any way, and as the only non-binary character in the cast, it subtly implies that to be non-binary is to be all of these things, to be untrustworthy, alien, and unnatural. That's bad, by the way. This is bad representation. Look, I'm sorry if you like Double Trouble, but they utterly fail at representing the group they're supposed to. It would have been better if they hadn't been made non-binary at all, because if this is genuinely supposed to represent people like me, then I am actually insulted. However, I cannot deny that DT is at least fun to watch, especially when they're reading Catra for filth. They're even genuinely funny sometimes. The same cannot be said for the other character I have lined up for you. Inescapable, No Rules No Rescue, is an absolute dumpster fire of a game that I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot barge pole, but thanks to Viveros and his delightfully detailed hate review of the game, I don't have to. I'll link to his video down below. It's where I got the footage, because God knows I'm not actually going to subject myself to playing this garbage. This is Sasha. Once again, the only NB in the cast, and also the single worst written non-binary character I've ever seen. Not only are they essentially just somber with the serial numbers filed off, but they're also just the fucking worst. They're an international criminal whose entire personality is misquoting Drag Race, threatening the safety of the other characters, and actual sexual harassment. Say what you will about Double Trouble, and I did, but at least they weren't a sex pest. What's more, Sasha's gender is implied to be just another way for them to obscure their actual identity, which explains why they become friends with the openly transphobic mob boss. Because if you don't care about your gender identity, why the fuck would transphobia bother you? Aside from, the fact that transphobes just fucking suck. Once again, we have the sole non-binary character being portrayed as a dangerous, untrustworthy villain, as well as an outsider with no attachments or even a hint of humanity. You can actually make villainous non-binary characters without making their gender a symptom of their villainy. You don't have to portray a group that already struggles with recognition and acceptance as being inherently untrustworthy and dangerous to everyone else. Hell, you could even leave these two as they are if you made one simple change. Can you guess what it is? Have more than one non-binary character in your cast. Yeah, see, this is how you move towards really good representation. Have 2 or more non-binary characters in your cast that present in different ways. The problem with a lot of games and shows is that they try to have one character represent the whole of a marginalized group, but the best representation happens when you explore it with more than one character. Just as having a single gay man or lesbian in a show doesn't work to represent the whole of homosexuality, a single androgynous character cannot come close to representing the whole of the non-binary community. Having multiple NBs also allows you to play around with their gender presentation more, and it will go a long way towards actually helpful representation. To demonstrate, let's take a look at the Owl House, which I honestly believe is still some of the best representation we've ever gotten. The Owl House has 4 different non-binary characters in it, and each looks vastly different. Everyone knows and loves Rain Whispers of Karis, but there's also Masha, the receptionist for the museum. Both are non-binary, but they present in such drastically different ways, and both are really good. Rain is the first to be introduced, and while they're fairly androgynous, they also have more of a masculine lean to their design, while Masha presents in an entirely feminine manner. Masha also paints their nails in the NB flag colours, which is a nice touch. Both use the same pronouns, but their designs and personalities are drastically different, and that's fantastic. Rain is one of the first times I've ever looked at a cartoon and felt that I was actually seeing someone like me. It was a reminder that despite how often masculine NBs are left out of the conversation, we're still here and we still matter. Beyond them, there's also the Collector, who goes by he, they, and whose entire aesthetic can be summarized as just a little guy, as well as King's dad, the Titan, who is still one of the only examples of a bi-gender character I've seen in any show.
I think King said it best once. I am both king and queen, best of both things. But Dad works fine.
Dana Terrace really demonstrated just how much she cared about representation when she made this show, and it's one of the reasons I love it so much. Boyfriend Dungeon is another good example of this, as it has 3 different NBs to date, and once again, each has an expressly different gender presentation. The first you'll meet is Rowan, who is kind of similar to Rain in that they're somewhat androgynous but masculine in their presentation. However, Rowan differs in that they explicitly state that they enjoy being more feminine sometimes, and if you invite them as your +1 to your cousin's wedding, they even show up in this gorgeous dress. They also have a fairly deep voice, which is a nice touch, and also a fairly rare feature for a non-binary character. They're a good example of contrasting elements. Interestingly, when everyone goes to the beach at the end of the game, Rowan wears what's kind of an old-fashioned men's swimsuit thing, I don't know what you call this. It's not meant to obscure the body like with the next character, but it's more conservative in its design, which fits Rowan's more reserved and old-fashioned mindset. Honestly, most of Rowan's design reflects this aspect of their personality, which is something that this game constantly pulls off quite well. You can usually tell a lot about a character's personality from their outfits in this game, something I might make a video on at some point. The second is Sawyer, whose design leans fully into androgyny, with very rounded features and both clothing and a haircut that are very gender neutral. Even their voice follows this trend. Sawyer doesn't really bring their gender identity up in the game, though if your character identifies as non-binary, then they'll mention that it's really cool to meet another NB. That isn't to say, however, that their design is lacking. I actually think it speaks volumes. Of the 3 NBs in the cast, Sawyer is the only one whose clothing always fully covers their body, and when paired with their awkwardly naive personality and the fact that they display a distinct lack of confidence, it reveals Sawyer to be more self-conscious of their presentation and how they come off to people. This is further reinforced by the fact that they wear a t-shirt and oversized trunks to the beach, reinforcing their discomfort about their own body. It would have been amazing if the game explored this at some point in the writing, but it's still cool that it comes out in their clothing. Finally, there's Dr. Holmes, whose entire look just screams, "I fell asleep working on my thesis," which they've absolutely done at some point. Holmes is unique amongst the NB characters of the game in that her pronouns are she, they, and the game actually makes sure to alternate between the 2 options, which shows good attention to detail. Their clothing is also somewhat gender neutral, but it's more to do with the fact that she works with machines in a lab and also as a college professor, so there's kind of no point in anything fancy, and loose clothing and jewellery would just get in the way. They're also not shy about her body either, as at one point they literally strip in front of you to go skinny dipping. Holmes is a very focused person whose mind is always on her work, even to the point of having detrimental effects on her life and well-being, and they even wear a lab coat to the beach right over her swimsuit. The only gripe I have with their design is the Crocs she wears, although that's just because I think Crocs are hideous. I really can't argue that it doesn't fit their personality. The creators of these 2 pieces of media put a lot of care into their representation, to the point that it's hard to find other shows or games that really compare. There definitely are those that do a good job in this regard though, like how Wandersong has both the Bard and Ash, who present masculinely and neutrally respectively, but the Owl House and Boyfriend Dungeon really do just stand head and shoulders above the rest in this regard. The only way they could have been better, and this is getting into the second way you can make your representation great, is if they actually explored the characters' relationships to their gender. I've said before that you don't necessarily have to explore a non-binary character's gender identity to make one, and I do stand by that. In games like Overwatch and Valorant, where the action takes precedence and the characters' personalities need to come across very quickly, it'd be hard to have an appropriately in-depth exploration of it during the pre-fight banter. I mean, it'd be pretty easy for me, but I'm not a writer in these games, and that level of character interaction isn't really what the games are about anyway, but I digress. The point is that you do not need to have a character talk about their gender identity, but more writers really should. Representation is far more powerful when it involves the characters having an actual conversation about it. If you're in the closet or even just questioning your identity, having a character say the words that you've been struggling to even identify can have a huge impact, and it also makes it easier for the majority of the population to understand something that can otherwise seem largely nebulous and theoretical in nature. I brought up Cal Bowman from Sex Education and Yu Asuka from Stars Align in my NB Rep video, and they're both really good examples with some powerful scenes, but outside of them, the only other time I can really find a character in a show actually expressing their feelings on their identity in this way is Fred the Bison from the show Really Jones.
My heart says that the way I feel most myself is to go by the name Fred. That's because I'm non-binary, and Fred is the name that fits me best. And I also use they and them, because calling me a she or a he doesn't feel right to me.
And I honestly can't think of any game I've played where a non-binary character actually talks about their identity and what it means to them. Even Boyfriend Dungeon only kind of brushes up against this with Rowan. I can think of two possible reasons for why this is the case. First, I think a lot of writers are still in the mindset that you have to be subtle with queer representation, a notion I could not disagree with more, and that is thankfully becoming less common. But as for the second reason, I think people are intimidated by it. I think there's a fear of backlash, both from the people you're trying to represent if you get it wrong, and from conservative shitheads who will go out and post videos of them shooting your product if you so much as glance in the direction of a rainbow. But you can alleviate that first issue by, like I said, utilizing sensitivity readers, and you just have to get the fuck over the second issue because conservatives will throw a fit no matter what you do, and the sooner you shut out their bitching, the happier you'll be. I think the easiest way to explore a non-binary character's gender identity, and follow me on this because it's likely going to sound counterintuitive to good representation, is to have someone accidentally misgender them and have the character correct them. Most media that features non-binary characters tends to just have everyone already use their correct pronouns, even if they've literally just met. And while this definitely functions as a way to make their gender identity feel like a natural and accepted part of the world, it also sacrifices some potentially really good characterization to do so. Part of the reality of being non-binary is having to correct people when they misgender you. It's a daily occurrence, and even the people who know you very well can slip up and use the wrong pronouns. And so showing how a character responds to being misgendered can really help flesh out their personality. When they correct the person, are they polite about it? Do they sound cheerful or irritated or maybe just really tired? Do they correct the person at all? And how does the misgenderer respond to that correction? Is this their first time misgendering the NB? Or is it a mistake that they make every now and then? Maybe this is their first time meeting a non-binary person at all, and so they're not sure how to handle it. There's a lot you can do with this kind of setup. Of course, there are a couple of good reasons why creators might avoid doing this. First of which being that they'd be afraid of being seen as transphobic by misgendering the character. And the second being that they're afraid of making the audience think that the character doing the misgendering is an asshole. Both of which can lead to audience backlash. And yes, there's certainly a risk that people will whiten out about it, but I think it'd be worth it to really explore the character. See, you can use this kind of interaction to lead into a discussion between the characters as to how the NB feels about their gender identity, about what it means to them and what they've gone through. Even the simple explanation of, I just don't feel like he or she really fit me, would be doing more than 99% of what we have now. Plus, it would give the members of the audience that are non-binary or are questioning their gender identity something to latch onto, to really see themselves for the first time on screen. And I really do think that would be worth the risk. You can elevate your non-binary representation to the staggering heights of really good by choosing either one of the two methods I've discussed, but it'll only be truly great if you include both. And to reiterate, I'm not saying that you shouldn't make androgynous non-binary characters. I've made a good few myself and they're very fun, but you'll do a much greater good for the community if you really put in the extra effort, because it'll mean that much more. Representation is so important, and character design is a huge part of that. But I feel like people can forget that the character's design should be informed by their personality, because people get so caught up on appearances that they forget what comes after that first impression. But by their very nature, non-binary people defy the analysis of that appearance that people so often rely on to formulate that first impression. Because our identity isn't just something you can't see, it exists apart from the very binary way most people see the world of gender, and non-binary characters should represent that. They should be varied, they should come in different forms and with different presentations, because to accept our existence, you need to accept that you've been limited by the perception of a false dichotomy that you probably never even considered. People are always going to be more complicated than you realise, and they're always going to surprise you. Let that truth shine through your character designs as well, and you won't just improve as a creator, you'll begin to see everything in a whole new light. Thank you for watching, and a huge thanks to my Patreon supporters for helping to keep the channel going. I'm sorry for my voice in this, I'm coming down with a cold. I originally intended for this video to be a bit shorter, but I ended up with a lot more to say once I actually sat down to write the script. I've been wanting to make more queer-focused content for a while, but I've been so wrapped up in other ongoing projects that I really just haven't found the time. I'm hoping to talk more on that in the coming year, and I'm glad I finally got to make this video. It's been on my mind for over a month. If you guys have an LGBT topic you'd like me to discuss at some point, comment it down below and I'll see what I can do. Anyway, I've got to get back to working on that Astarion video, so I hope you have a lovely day and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.